In this video, we're going to talk about a market structure called monopoly. When economists study monopoly, they're trying to understand what happens when only one firm controls the supply of a good or service in a marketplace. We know that firms like Google are not like firms in perfect competition. And we want to understand when firms dominate a market, what kind of prices do they charge? What type of quantities do they supply? And today, when we think about monopoly, we think about companies like Google, but in the past, we might have thought about companies like Microsoft or IBM or Bell Telephone, who at one time or another were sued by the Justice Department for being a monopoly. A monopoly is a situation where a market has only one supplier of a good or service. In this case, the good or service has no close substitutes. And this is very important. There are barriers to entry that exist that prevent new firms from entering a market and competing with a monopolist. And information may be asymmetric or imperfect. There are three types of barriers to entry that can exist. A barrier to entry is a constraint that protects a firm from potential competitors. The three types of barriers to entry can be categorized as either a natural barrier to entry, an ownership barrier to entry, or a legal barrier to entry. When there's a natural barrier to entry, we call it a natural monopoly. This is a case where the economies of scale enable one firm to produce the supply for an entire market and still be at the lowest possible cost. In this case, when the firm is producing 4 million kilowatt hours, it's doing so at a cost and a price of 5 cents per kilowatt hour. We could imagine a situation where two firms were providing power in this market, each one producing 2 million kilowatt hours. Well, at that point, the lowest cost and therefore the price they could provide it at would be 10 cents. So when two firms provide the supply in the market, the cost and the price is higher. It's 10 cents than when only one firm provides. And this is what happens in a natural monopoly. The economies of scale are so powerful, they're still being achieved when the entire market demand is being met by a single firm. So if the market demand is 4 million kilowatt hours, one firm providing that can provide that at the lowest cost. The economies of scale are very powerful here and are still declining when only one firm is providing the entire market demand. So it makes economic sense to have one firm produce it. This is the case of a natural monopoly. We also have something called an ownership monopoly, where only one firm owns really all or a majority of a key resource. There aren't many examples of this. One example might be the De Beers mining company, which owns about 90% of the world's diamonds. And the last and most common type of monopoly is a legal monopoly. In this case, competition and entry are restricted by a government. This might be a public franchise like the U.S. Postal Service with first-class mail, or it might be a government license, licenses to practice law or medicine or to cut hair or things like that, are a form of a legal monopoly. They're restrictions by government that stop people from entering and competing. And then last, a copy or patent right is another example of a barrier to entry that restricts competition. Now, let's talk about monopolies and how they set prices. This is one big difference between a monopoly and perfect competition. In perfect competition, firms are price takers. They can't set the price, but that's not true with the monopoly, because the monopolist determines both the quantity it sells and the price. The monopolist is a price setter, not a price taker. Now, there are two types of pricing strategies. a single price monopoly where they charge the same price to everyone, and then price discriminating monopoly where they charge a different price to everyone. Let's start by talking about the single price monopoly. In a single price monopoly, we have a downward sloping demand curve, and here we can assume that when the firm sells 2 units, the price is $16 each, so they make $32 in revenue. If they were to drop the price by $2 to $14, well, they'd sell a third unit. So they'll gain more from selling an additional unit even at a lower price, and they give up from the lower price in the first 2 units. So they make an incremental $10 in revenue. They make $42 instead of $32. And so their marginal revenue, their incremental revenue for the third unit is $10. And if we were to draw that out, we'd see that the marginal revenue, the incremental revenue at every quantity is lower than the actual demand. It's inside the demand curve. And so the marginal revenue is lower than the price at every quantity. Well, what does that do? Well, first of all, a single price monopoly never produces an output where the demand is inelastic. So they only will produce in this blue section here, because by producing in this blue section, they're able to maximize total revenue. If they were to move into the red section here and produce at a quantity there, their total revenue would decrease, which they're not going to do. So they only produce in the elastic part of the demand curve where total revenue is maximized. So in a monopoly, the monopolist will set the quantity the same way that it's done in perfect competition. As a matter of fact, the same way it's done in all market structures. They select the profit maximizing quantity where the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost. And then they decide what the price is by going to the highest price they can sell that quantity for. Let's take a look. So the monopolist will choose a quantity that maximizes their total economic profit. This is where the difference between their total revenue and their total cost is the greatest. That happens to be the same point where the marginal revenue and the marginal cost intersect each other. So the marginal revenue curve is the incremental revenue at each quantity. The marginal cost curve will rise as quantity goes up, and where they intersect each other, where the marginal revenue and the marginal cost are equal, that's the quantity that will maximize their economic profit. That's the quantity the monopolist chooses to produce. But then they have to decide what price to set. So they will sell that quantity at the highest price they can. If you take the price of this quantity, go up to the demand curve, this point here, you go across, and they're able to sell it at 14. So their average total costs here are 10. Their average, the price they're selling it at is 14. So they're making $4 on each of the 3 units. So it's $12 in economic profit. Now, the monopolist can make an economic profit in the short run, but it can also make an economic profit in the long run. Because unlike in perfect competition, in monopoly, there are barriers to entry that protect a firm from market entry by other firms, so they don't face any competition. And this is what makes a monopoly valuable to producers, the fact that they can make an economic profit in the long run. So we see here, if we compare a monopoly with a perfectly competitive market, and we superimpose the 2 graphs over top of each other, that in perfect competition, the marginal cost and the marginal revenue intersect here. So the competitive quantity is QC, the competitive price is PC. In monopoly, the marginal revenue and marginal cost curves intersect here, so they produce a lower quantity, QM, and they sell it at a higher price, PM. So in monopoly, the output is lower and the price is higher. So compared to perfect competition, monopoly produces a smaller output and charges a higher price. And so we know that perfect competition is efficient because it balances, it uses resources efficiently, it produces at the lowest cost, and it balances the uh, the plans of buyers and the plans of sellers in a way that maximizes the quantity and minimizes the price. And so perfect competition, we know, is efficient. Monopoly is inefficient. Remember, the quantity in monopoly is less than the quantity in perfect competition. So there's a deadweight loss that arises from the products that could be produced that are not. It's also true that some of the consumer surplus that used to go to consumers is now the economic profit and the monopolists' gain. So for these reasons, we say that monopoly is inefficient. In monopoly, the output is lower and the price is higher. So consumers are worse off. Now let's talk briefly about a price discriminating monopoly. So price discrimination is a situation where you sell the same product to two different people at two different prices. Now, this in many cases is illegal. It's against the law to do that. You have to treat everybody the same. But if you can identify and separate your buyers into different types, like students or seniors, well, then you can give them a discount based on when they come um, or their status as a student or a senior, and anybody who fits the category would be able to get it. And this way, you can charge two different prices to two different people. You can charge the students one price, and then the rest of the public another price, or seniors one price and the rest of the public another price. And let's see why you would do that. Well, one of the reasons you would do that is you'd want to charge a higher price to some people, and then you would charge a lower price to maybe somebody who wouldn't be able to or willing to pay the higher price. And then you get both the higher price from some people and the low, and you're also able to sell at a lower price to people who wouldn't otherwise buy it. So in doing this, you're able to convert some of that consumer surplus into economic profit because you're charging some of the people a higher price than you would have been able to in a single price situation. Now, the more perfectly you can do this, the more closely you can make the output similar to perfect competition. So in this case, in a single price monopoly, you'd stop the quantity here, but now you can maybe produce more units because you're able to charge the people, the seniors or the students, the lower price, and you're able to charge the rest of the public a higher price. And in total, you're making more revenue and more economic profit in that situation than you would have if you just charged one price. So you do increase the output higher than you would in a single price monopoly, but you also convert some of the consumer surplus and benefits into economic profit. Let's talk about rent seeking. Now, rent seeking is the pursuit of monopoly as a way to capture economic rent or economic profit, and to be able to do so in the long run. So rent seekers might make political contributions or hire lobbyists or use political activity as a way of securing a monopoly. Why would they spend money to do that? Well, they would spend money to do that because by having a monopoly, they can make an economic profit in the long run, and that's really what they're trying to accomplish or purchase. They will use they'll use resources in political activity to get these barriers established, and if they're able to do that successfully, they can make an economic profit in the long run. And this process we call rent seeking. But rent seeking is inefficient. The resources used in rent seeking can exhaust some of the monopolist economic profit, and it will in effect cause the total cost to increase and some of the economic profits to disappear. So rent seeking is there are incentives for people to do rent seeking, to spend money on political activity to get barriers to entry established, but in the process of spending that money, costs go up and some of the economic profits go down. And if there's enough of that happening, then you can eliminate the economic profits altogether. So Let's talk for a minute about monopoly regulation. First of all, there's an agency in the Department of Justice called the Antitrust Division, and they work to attempt to restrict monopoly and promote competition. There are laws against being a monopolist. There's certain behaviors that firms cannot engage in, such as price fixing or working with their competitors to set prices. And there's a number of activities and behaviors that firms are not allowed to engage in. And if the Justice Department feels that you're engaging in those activities, they will prosecute you. They will sue you for violating the antitrust laws that have been passed by Congress. And the Justice Department in the Antitrust Division is the group in the government that's tasked with enforcing our antitrust laws against either being or behaving like a monopoly. Recently, in November, the Justice Department sued Google for illegally behaving as a monopolist in the search market, in the market for search advertising. That case is going on. These cases typically take maybe a decade in order to complete. They might take 10 years in order to happen. This has happened before. As I mentioned, Microsoft was sued in the 1980s for being a monopolist, and IBM was sued in the 1970s for being a monopolist, and Bell Telephone was sued between the 1960s and 70s for being a monopolist. And so this happens from time to time when people become when a single provider gets control over a market and maybe engages in behaviors that are considered to be monopolistic or specifically in violation of our antitrust laws. And so we'll have to see how this plays out. Now, it's also true that there's sometimes with a natural monopoly, like when it makes economic sense for there to be only one provider, that we have one provider. This is typically what happens with a utility company or a power company. And then the question is, well, how can the government regulate a natural monopoly so it produces the efficient quantity? Because remember, monopolies want to produce less and charge higher prices. If we allow a monopoly to exist in something like a utility company, like Baltimore Gas and Electric, or in New York, I think it's Con Edison, then how do we make sure they produce the right amount and don't charge too much? Well, we have these types of firms are also regulated, and you might do something like a marginal cost pricing rule. You basically say, well, you have to charge the marginal cost that you are experiencing and not some higher price or cost. Now, the problem with this is it may be the case that the marginal cost will force the one supplier into an economic loss. So regulators have to allow some sort of price discrimination or allow maybe a one-time fee or provide a subsidy in order for this to work. You might also have an average cost pricing rule where you basically say, okay, we're going to allow you to charge a price equal to the average cost. Well, in that case, you're not producing all the quantity maybe that's needed. And so the government might have to pay a subsidy in order to get you to supply that last amount. Another solution is to set some sort of a price cap or ceiling with the idea that hopefully the firm would then have to expand their output in order to still make money at that lower price and kind of force them in the situation. But then without a market, without competition, how do you know what that price cap should be set at? The solution that's often implemented, especially with utility companies and power companies, is some sort of rate of return regulation, where the firm has to justify its price by showing that its return does not exceed some agreed upon target in advance. The firm might be able to make a 10% return, and then they have to prove that their prices are supporting a 10% return, but no more, a 10% profit, but no more. The problem with this is that the firm has an incentive to inflate their costs and might use more capital than is really necessary. They might, since their profit is determined by how much their costs are, they may inflate their costs or increase their costs and do so in an inefficient way. So the point here is that monopoly regulation is not easy, whether it's the antitrust division in the Justice Department suing a company for being a monopoly or engaging in monopoly behaviors, or it's a local or state agency that is trying to regulate a power or utility company, which is a natural monopoly. In any of these cases, it's complicated, it's difficult, and honestly, it often fails. The good news is that most monopolies are temporary in nature, and over time, they're eliminated through competition. If you look back in the case of Microsoft, in the case of IBM, and even the telephone company, what happened in the end was by the time the suits were settled, maybe a decade or so later, the technology in the market or the competition in the market had changed, and they really were not in the position of power or control that they once were. And so, as competition eventually will enable the monopoly to lose its power. Now, monopolies that exist in the long run are usually the result of government actions or laws. And so we have to be careful when we're making government regulations and laws and taking government actions that we're not creating monopolies as either an intended or an unintended consequence. So this is our summary on monopoly. Remember, monopoly is a situation where you only have one seller. It's really a situation that describes an absence of competition. The firm is selling a product for which there's really no substitutes or choices for consumers. And in order for this to happen, in order for there to be a monopoly, there has to be a barrier to entry and exit that stops people from coming in and competing when the monopolist makes an economic profit. Now, monopolists determine both the output and the price, but they do so in a way where they're able to make an economic profit in the long run. And economic profits are possible in the long run in monopoly because barriers to entry block competition. Competition is the thing that enables, that stops monopoly from happening. If you have a barrier to entry, you won't have any competition, so the monopoly will be able to exist in the long run, and the monopoly will be able to make an economic profit in the long run. Now, we hate monopoly because monopoly is inefficient. It creates a lesser output and it charges a higher price than we see in competitive markets.